Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
Just over a week ago, most of these people were candidates. Today, they're elected members of the new Idaho legislature on tour in North Idaho. While they were looking over sawmills and college campuses this week, they were also considering one of the most important political questions in the state today, namely who will lead the next legislature. Tonight, we'll have a report on that, and we'll also hear from some veteran and freshman legislators about the state's financial situation.
Good evening. In just over a month and a half, the 1985 session of the Idaho legislature will open, facing, as usual, major problems with the state budget. It will be a very different legislature than the one that completed its business here in Boise in April of this year. For one thing, there will be 21 more members due to reapportionment. Due to reapportionment as well and a turnover in membership, there will be a lot of new faces in the legislature, 39 altogether, nearly 1/3 of the total membership. There is some chance in the House of Representatives that there will be a new speaker in the next session. At minimum, there will be new members of Republican and Democratic leadership teams in both the House and the Senate. And due to Republican numbers in the legislature, in theory at least, the legislature will be veto-proof. That is, if Republicans hang together in the House and the Senate, they will be able to override the vetoes of the Democratic governor. All of those factors contributed this week to unusual interest in the legislative tour, sponsored every other year by the North Idaho Chamber of Commerce. Videographer Ricardo Ochoa and I went along as over 100 legislators toured and politicked in the Moscow-Lewiston area.
Just north of Moscow in Latah County, near the tiny Idaho community of Princeton, sits one of the most modern, most completely automated lumber mill operations in the world, the Bennett Lumber Company sawmill, one stop for legislators on their whirlwind North Idaho tour this week.
As you came up from Moscow, you saw quite a bit of farm ground intermixed with some timber ground.
For businessmen from Boise and farmers from Franklin County, this is a rare opportunity to see northern Idaho industry and facilities like the Port of Lewiston up close.
This area, not only the Port of Lewiston, but also including the Port of Wilma, represents itself as the largest inland container facility in the western United States, and I think that we're all proud of that.
This exposure is a major reason why the North Idaho Chamber of Commerce invests tens of thousands of dollars to bring Idaho's lawmakers north of the Salmon for 2 days.
Some of the folks south of the Salmon River don't get north too often, and this is an opportunity that for them to come up and see what we have in North Idaho, for us to brag a little bit and ask for some help as the need be.
Obviously, there are a lot of folks who live north of the Salmon who think that in the legislature, at least, you get not as much attention as you deserve. Does this help remedy that situation a little?
Well, we'd like to think so. We do this at some considerable cost to our members and supporters in North Idaho, and we'd like to think that we do some good by doing this every 2 years immediately after the election.
Of course, for the people like me, one of the big attractions is all of the politicking that takes place among the politicians here. Is that just an offshoot of when this happens, or was that by design?
Well, I can't take credit for it being by design specifically, but obviously this is the first opportunity that the legislators have after the general election to get together, and we don't hesitate to capitalize on that as far as the timing of our tour is concerned. It does help encourage them to attend.
Ultimately, it is the politics that gives this event its every other year importance. And this year particularly, the political importance is the challenge to House Speaker Tom Stivers by the current chairman of the House Revenue and Taxation Committee, Steve Antone. Both used the 2-day tour to do some intensive politicking, each trying to line up the 34 votes needed from Republican House members to elect a Speaker of the House. Reporters from Idaho Public Television, the Idaho Statesman, and the Lewiston Morning Tribune polled the Republican House members on the trip to see how they're lining up in the Speaker's battle. Despite claims from both candidates that they have more votes than their opponent, the poll shows a wide-open, highly competitive race for Speaker. 11 lawmakers said they were firmly pledged to Stivers, 11 to Antone. More were leaning to the current Speaker. But many, 16 according to the poll, have yet to decide on the Speaker's race. This inside political race is so important because the Speaker has great power to influence the course of legislation. He appoints members to committees and can appoint chairmen. Stivers has used the power effectively to put his stamp on important committees like Revenue and Taxation. But at times, because of his hard-charging personal style and his very conservative politics, he's found himself abandoned by some of the moderates in his own party. That happened last session on a key tax increase vote. Steve Antone is the acknowledged leader of the moderate faction in the House. His style, unlike Stivers, is to operate backstage, to forge coalitions, sometimes even with Democrats. His style, again in contrast to the Speaker, is low-key, but that's generally thought to have been a liability in his previous attempts to win the top House leadership job. Stivers, meanwhile, is confident that he'll win again.
Well, Mark, I think I've told you in the past I learned how to count a long time ago. And I've met most all these new people. And the election proved, to me at least, and I think to a lot of people in the state of Idaho, what direction this legislature will take due to the number of people that were elected and their political philosophy. And most of those political philosophies are identical with mine. Now, I don't go to a new legislator and say, are you going to support me for Speaker? I've never done that. And I will not do that. I just present my case to the people and to the new legislators and say, there it is. You make up your own mind. And I feel very comfortable with what I've got. Very comfortable. And I used that word last night. I used it again tonight.
Well, let me say this, that neither one of us have it yet. The vote's still out there. There's a lot of uncommitted votes at this time. But I think that I'm in very good shape to go over the top.
What's your strategy to appeal to those folks who haven't decided one way or the other?
Visit with them, explain my programs, how we can get the session through early, if we can institute certain new programs, new ways to go, to get to work, to keep everybody at work, that we'll get out of there 20 to 30 days sooner.
Current House Assistant Majority Leader Bob Geddes of Preston is a wild card in all of this. Geddes has some support to make the Speaker's race, but at this point, he has not committed one way or the other. There are other House leadership races. Current Majority Leader Jack Kenevic of Boise is facing a challenge from Tom Boyd of Genesee, and Caucus Chairman Lyndon Bateman of Idaho Falls is being challenged by Dean Hageson of Coeur d'Alene. The Senate Republican leadership picture is less clear, but it is almost certain that President Pro Tem James Risch of Boise will retain his job. House Democrats, with only 17 members now, have races for each of their leadership positions. Senate Democrats also have some contests for assistant floor leader and for caucus chairman.
And when I say I'm really glad you're here, I mean it. I just wish we could have you here longer than a day or a half a day, because I really believe that the more you see of what we're doing, the more positive you will be. And by the same token, I think it works the other way too, and the more that we get familiar with what you do and your problems, the more positive we will be.
University of Idaho President Richard Gibb, not surprisingly, used his crack at the lawmakers during the North Idaho tour to pitch higher education funding. The lawmakers had a tightly packaged tour of the University School of Mines, Agriculture, and Forestry, and the political message in the tour was hard to miss.
As chairman of the Theater Arts Department, I welcome you to the Hartung Theater, one of the finest teaching facilities in the Northwest. We will shortly open William Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, which explains the odd construction behind us. And perhaps it was Shakespeare who said, "What is past is prologue." But we trust that the difficulties the state and higher education have faced are in the past, and that this legislative session will serve as prologue for decisions which will give substance to all of our dreams. It is my pleasure at this time to introduce a man who is familiar to most of you, one who has taken great care in these difficult times to preserve the academic integrity of this institution, Dr. Richard D. Gibb, President of the University of Idaho. Dr. Gibb.
I could tell you that our budget has declined from in higher education from 20.5% of the total to 14.5%. But I'm not going to tell you that today. And I could tell you that we have eliminated 264 positions at this institution in the last 5 years, but I'm not going to tell you that today either. But our problems are enormous. And what we have at this university is too good to lose. And surely some additional dollars invested in it will pay off not only for the university, but for the entire state. And when I say that, I want to say the same thing for our sister institutions, because it's true there also. It's not just the University of Idaho. All 4 of the institutions of higher learning in this state, those that are publicly supported, are having major problems with budgets. And so while you're here, I want to repeat what the 4 presidents had a chance to say a couple of weeks ago, and that is higher education needs better funding. So today I'm making a plea not just for this institution, but for Lewis Clark and Boise State and Idaho State as well.
Lewis and Clark State College President Lee Vickers also got his crack at the lawmakers.
How important is it to you to have a chance to have these people actually on your campus and see your facility?
Oh, it's very, very important because, as I said, many of them have not been here. Many of them are not aware of what the college is all about, or they have misconceptions. For example, one of them, I overheard a conversation and thought it was a junior college. So we're dealing with a situation where many of them are just not informed. So it gives us a chance to actually show them the students, the faculty, the staff, the buildings, and that's much, much better than just talking about that in Boise.
Senator James McClure.
The more money for education message was strongly reinforced by a Republican that Republican legislators will likely listen to with some close attention.
We're trying to determine whether or not there is a place for academic research funded by the federal government dealing with such questions as agriculture. And I say the answer to that must be a resounding yes. Whether it is government investment in basic research in agriculture, or basic research in medicine, or basic research at a nuclear lab like that at INL in southeastern Idaho, our society is greatly enriched by the public investment in basic human knowledge. Human knowledge that does not have an immediate profit incentive in the private sector. And you know, I am saying that as a conservative Republican, as somebody who believes that not all the answers lie in government expenditures, but believes that we have gone too far in that direction in the past, but let's not overreact by denying the opportunities that come from constructive investment in the public sector. Just as our investment in research is important to the public benefit and good today, so is our investment in education. The legislature is going to have a great difficulty this time, and they don't need the advice from a United States Senator. I don't muck around in their business very much. But I'm a citizen of this state. I have children that live in this state. I hope to have grandchildren who live in this state, who are educated in the educational institutions of this state, and I recognize the limitations on the ability of this state to finance its public institutions. A pledge was made to education in the last session of the legislature with respect to the career ladder in primary and secondary and the reform of education and the increased funding of primary and secondary education. There is an unmet and unstated commitment that must be made to the institutions of higher education in this state.
McClure, who just over a week ago won a smashing re-election victory, also used his crack at the legislature to get off some pointed words about reapportionment.
I'm very, very happy to see so many of my old friends in the legislature, and I think some of my new friends in the legislature will understand that it's not just a partisan remark when I say I'm glad to see so many of my friends here tonight. And it is somewhat partisan. You know, I can't help but digress for a moment because I said it during the campaign. We're so close after it, it's hard to forget. That is that I believe that the legislative reapportionment, while it was born out of a lawsuit in northern Idaho that was built by the Democrats who held the legislative seats in order to protect their own constituencies, was really impelled by a partisan fight down in southeastern Idaho in Bannock County, aimed to enhance and protect a particular incumbent or constituency near and dear to the governor of our state. And the Floterial District, which in my view is a perversion of the notion of equal representation. But the governor adopted that, or I should say embraced it, because he believed that there was some partisan advantage in building constituencies around major communities that would dominate the Floterial districts and thus enhance the partisan political leverage in the legislature by the Democrats. And I said during the campaign, I hope we'd stick it in his ear, and even though he may be vacationing, he's got it in his ear. That's an inelegant phrase, but there are other phrases equally descriptive that are less elegant. And I know, talking to Tom Stivers and Jim Risch and other members of the legislature, that perhaps that particular political perversion will be hard to shed in this or any other session of the legislature. I hope the time will come when we can get rid of this abomination, which is not equal representation at all, but is a political aberration.
Even with McClure's direct and forceful plea over reapportionment, there are few among the members of the legislature, be they incumbent or newcomer, who predict any changes in the way reapportionment is being handled. Next to the speculation and the lobbying about legislative leadership positions, most attention on the Northern Idaho tour was devoted to wonder and some legitimate worry about how to fund education. Higher education is, of course, crying for the kind of budget attention that public schools received from the last session of the legislature, and public school reform legislation still must be fully implemented in 1985. I sampled some opinions on the budget situation, beginning with the two candidates for Speaker of the House.
With our exposure today to higher education, and we know what we're faced with public school funding. Now the federal judge has dictated reformation of the Department of Corrections, the penitentiary system. That's just the tip of the iceberg. The rest of the departments and agencies, you can go through state employees' salaries, maintenance and improvement of buildings, state-owned buildings. You can go right down the line, increase in salaries and all that kind of stuff. So we're faced with a tremendous funding problem. I am hopeful that the turn of the economy itself, which looks good to me right now, will be sufficient in a major effort to reducing some of the impact on perhaps trying to raise taxes to solve some of these problems. And it's going to be tough, and there's no question about it. You're talking about somewhere between $60 and $80 million we're going to be short if everybody gets what they want. And I don't expect that to happen, but it's going to be somewhere in that area that from the wants to the needs to the possibilities is a tough thing to handle right now, and without additional tax increases.
The other candidate for Speaker, Steve Antone, says specific legislative attention to both public school and higher education funding needs might mean a tax increase.
Well, I think there'll have to be additional revenue if we're going to have solve both issues. We'll have to pick up somewhere if we're going to fund higher education and keep the educational reform bill going. The problem with the educational reform bill calls for $13 million, I think, this year. But there's also other things in public education that need funding, such as keeping up buildings and supplies and so forth.
So to do both will be...
It's pretty impossible, really. It's just something that you'll have to work at.
A lot of the responsibility has been placed on the Republican caucus now to take care of those services that are demanded by the public, and we can... I think there's some coalitions that can be built and some positive things can come out of that. I'm a perpetual positive individual, or I wouldn't be a Democrat farmer in Idaho, I guess, but I think there's some things that can happen.
to try and do some of the things that we set out to do in the last year of the last session. It's going to be difficult, and I don't think anyone that's in the legislature, either for a period of time or coming in the first time, won't recognize that. It's going to be a very tough year for us.
The moderate Republicans are in the driver's seat. If they choose to ask us to come along, I think there might be enough of us there, although I'm not sure of that, to help them increase some budgets where it's needed, to go against the extreme conservative element that is in the Senate and has been in the House for a good while. That remains to be seen as to whether those bridges can be built. I'm optimistic, believe that they can. Have to be.
At least one of those so-called moderate Republicans believes the political pressure will be squarely on the Republican Party to deal aggressively with education budgets.
Well, we'll have to see. A lot will depend upon the makeup of the various revenue and tax committees of the legislature. Certainly, I think the senior statesman of the Idaho Republican Party set the mood in Lewiston last night, emphasizing the extreme importance to the Republican Party in the state of Idaho of adequate funding both for public schools and our higher educational system. Senator McClure made it clear that that should be, I think, a very top priority item and will perhaps have a significant impact on how our party performs and succeed in the next very critical election.
I take it from that you might think that Republicans would be at some political risk if they did not, if they were not perceived to treat education
I think
properly.
they would be, yes. I noticed, for instance, Mark, we had some very close elections for the legislature this time, and I noticed in several of those races the candidates were very anxious to be pictured with Jerry Evans, for instance, a leader in Idaho education. In the sales tax question on repealing the sales tax on food, people very frequently alluded to the importance of protecting those funds for the educational system, and I think those candidates and people were reading the mood of the public properly.
As I mentioned earlier, 39 members of the next session of the legislature will be freshmen serving for the first time. Many were on the tour in North Idaho earlier this week, getting their first official look at the problems they will face as members of the state legislature. I asked some of the newcomers for their view of the major issue, what concerns them most as they look ahead to the session. Without exception, the answer was how to fund the state budget.
I think funding levels is going to be a critical issue to be concerned with. The education, we toured the University of Idaho yesterday, and they certainly need more money, and I'm sure these people will show us the funds that they need. I think the funding level will be a critical issue.
Funding has to be at the top of the list, no question about it. But there seems to be an underlying issue as well, and that is legislative image. Will the legislature appear to be responsive and responsible? I mean, many of the new legislators seem to be very concerned about that.
What single issue most concerns you as you look ahead to the next legislature?
Probably funding of education and some of that aspects. Of course, I think that's one of the main reasons the university played such, both universities are playing such a role this time in this tour is the funding. And I think that'll be an issue.
Well, I think the issue that concerns me personally most is the proper funding of higher education. And the last 2 days I've had a chance to, particularly at the University of Idaho, to see the College of Mines, Forestry, and Agriculture, where I realized that the tremendous investment those universities have made towards the improvement of the economy of the state, and I think we need to fund that. It's a cycle. That cycle needs to be continued. One hand helps the other.
I think it's the one that seemed to concern everyone, that's education. The funding level, where are we going to get our revenues, and are we going to be able to continue to fulfill the commitment made to education that was started the last session?
Oh, I think my mind hasn't changed too much on that, Mark. I think the budget and the finances and taxes and these sorts of things, how we're going to finance all of these things we want in the state.
The issue of funding. There are a lot of programs that people are concerned about and interested in and supportive of. And to support those programs, we're going to need funds. We're going to have to look at different ways to provide those funds, or else have to find out what we can do with the programs.
Well, I think my main concern right now is the committee structure and how that will work out. I'm hoping that I'll have an opportunity to put input where I have some expertise and work towards the issues that I've been most concerned about in my campaign. Those being development of jobs and improving the economic climate in Idaho. So I think as I look particularly towards January and the new balance of things within the Senate, I'm real concerned about how that's going to work out. And of course, the first year is a learning experience, so I'm hoping that I'll have lots of help in learning the ropes.
Well, I think the major issue is going to be it's a little bit out of our control, an issue of what kind of resources we're going to have for the budget next year. So what kind of revenues have been coming in and how much money is going to be there, because really in state government, everything that we're going to do and the way that we approach our problems is going to depend on a great extent how much money is available and where we're going to be able to put it. And it looks that, every time we hear a revenue projection, it looks a little better and a little better. So hopefully we'll have 2 years of lots of revenues and no problems in Boise. The way that our state tax system is set up, when we have a good economy, it tends to generate a lot of money, and we've even had surplus. In the 70s we had lots of money. We had money for higher education, those kind of things. I'm hoping that we can generate those kind of revenues again. As a state legislator, what I think it's incumbent on us to do is to try to make state government work in cooperation with business and the economy to promote that kind of healthy environment, because I think the taxing system, when we've got a healthy economy, the taxing system draws out on us so that we have sufficient revenues to operate state government.
The last word on the budget picture tonight goes to a man who perhaps more than anyone else will have a lot to say about it, the Senate President Pro Tem, James Risch of Boise.
Obviously, part of the message you heard today was more money for higher education. Is that likely in the next legislature?
Well, Mark, I think it is likely. I think that the legislature, by and large, appreciates the fact that our primary education has gotten first fiddle, really, over recent years. And that's hurt our higher education system, and it's hurt it particularly in light of the fact that our higher education system is very much subject to the law of supply and demand when it comes to teachers. That isn't true with the rest of the educational system, but it's certainly true with higher education, and I think we're seeing that. And I think that's one of the areas that the legislature is going to be looking at very hard this year.
Does it necessarily follow then that public schools, maybe the second year of the public school reform bill, would suffer in some way at the expense of more money for higher education?
Not necessarily. I would say not necessarily.
The money's there to do all that?
Well, I'm optimistic. The figures we've been looking at are very optimistic, and I think it is possible to do both of those things. We've also got a problem in the prison area. I think the prison area and higher education are going to be two very high, if not the highest priority items that the legislature works on this year.
I neglected to mention earlier that the leadership elections will be held during the organizational session on December 6th. That's our time tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.